Chapter 2. A White Wedding. The big freeze had come in, covering the castle in a deep blanket of snow. On a sunny late afternoon in the breathtakingly still air, pencil-thin columns of smoke rose from 1,000 chimneys up into the sky. Along Wizard Way, a crowd had gathered to watch a wedding procession walk from the great arch to the palace. As the procession passed by, people from the crowd dropped in, behind, and followed, chattering about the young couple who had just gotten married in the great hall of the Wizard Tower, Simon and Lucy Heap. Simon Heap, with his curly straw-colored hair, neatly tied back in a ponytail, wore new blue robes, which, as the son of an ordinary wizard, he was entitled to do on his wedding day. The freshly dyed blue was bright, and trimmed with traditional white wedding ribbons, which trailed behind him. Lucy Heap, née Gringe, was wearing a long, white, floaty woolen dress, which she had knitted herself and edged with pink fur. She had lovingly embroidered entwined blue and pink letters S and L across the skirt. Her mother had objected to this, saying it was bad taste, and for once, in matters of taste, Mrs. Gringe was probably right. But it was Lucy's big day, and what Lucy wanted to do, Lucy was going to do. No change there, then, her brother Rupert had remarked. The wedding party progressed down Wizard Way toward the palace, crunching through newly fallen snow. The sky was a brilliant winter blue, but a small snow cloud directly above obligingly provided a few fat snowflakes, which floated down and landed on Lucy's bare-boned, long brown hair, where they settled like confetti. Lucy and Simon were laughing and talking happily to each other, Lucy twirling in the snow to show off her dress, and sharing a joke with her new brothers. Next to Lucy walked her own brother Rupert, and his girlfriend Maggie. Simon had considerably more companions, his adoptive sister, Princess Jenna, and his 6 brothers, including the 4 Forest Heaps, Sam, twins, Ed and Eric, and Jojo. Mrs. Theodora Gringe, mother of the bride, walked right behind her daughter, occasionally treading on Lucy's train in her eagerness to be at the front. When they had emerged from the great arch, Mrs. Gringe had had to be restrained from actually leading the wedding party down Wizard Way. Lucy's mother was the proudest mother of the bride that the castle had seen for a long time. Who would have imagined, thought Theodora Gringe, that the guests at her daughter's wedding would have included the great dignitaries of the castle, the extraordinary wizard, the princess, and the chief hermetic scribe, and even that weird alchemist fellow. They were all here. There was no doubt about it. The Gringes were on the way up. But it was a shame, she thought, about the Heaps. They were a disreputable-looking bunch, and there were so many of them. Everywhere she looked, she saw the distinctive curly, straw-colored Heap hair, topping a scruffy-looking individual. The Gringes were massively outnumbered. A shout of laughter drew Theodora Gringe's attention to a group of 4 noisy men who reminded her of Silas Heap, and who, she supposed correctly, were his brothers. Mrs. Gringe grimaced and cast her critical eye over the Heaps she recognized. She grudgingly admitted to herself that Silas and Sarah looked smart enough in their blue and white wedding clothes, if a little eccentric with Sarah carrying that ridiculous duck in a bag. Mrs. Gringe eyed up the duck, ready plucked, perfect for a stew. Deciding to suggest that to Sarah later, she scrutinized the Heap boys with mixed feelings. The 2 youngest, Nico and Septimus, weren't too bad. Septimus in particular looked rather fine in his impressive formal apprentice robes, with the long purple ribbons dangling from his sleeves. He was taller than Mrs. Gringe remembered, and she noticed that his typical Heap hair had actually been combed. She didn't approve of Nico's sailor's braid, wound through his hair, although she supposed that his sober navy blue boatyard tunic, with its rather fetching sailor's collar, was acceptable. But at the sight of the remaining Heaps, Theodora Gringe's mouth puckered in distaste. The 4 Forest boys were a disgrace. She tutted as she watched Sam, Ed, Eric, and Jojo straggle along beside the bridegroom like— she searched for the right words. Yes, that was it. Like a pack of wolverines. At least they could have had the decency to keep to the back. While the wedding party had been in the Wizard Tower courtyard, Mrs. Gringe had tried to push the Forest boys to the back. A struggle had ensued, and her husband Gringe had had to drag her off. "Let it be, Theodora," he'd hissed. "They are Lucy's brothers now." Mrs. Gringe had felt quite faint at the thought. She had had to take a long look at their trophy guest, Madame Marcia Overstrand, extraordinary wizard, to get over it, which had been a little embarrassing, as Marcia had asked her rather sharply if there was something wrong. Mortified by the memory, Mrs. Gringe sighed, and then realized that she had been overtaken by the crowd. happily unaware that the tall, pointy felt triangle perched on top of her hat gave onlookers the impression that a shark was cruising through the wedding party, stalking the bride. Mrs. Gringe began to elbow her way back up to the front. At last they reached the palace gate. The onlookers clustered around, offering congratulations, gifts, and good wishes. Lucy and Simon accepted them all, laughing, exclaiming, handing the gifts to various friends and relations to carry for them. Sarah Heap linked her arm through Silas's and smiled at him. She felt unbelievably happy. For the first time since the day Septimus had been born, she had all her boys with her. It seemed as though a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. In fact, right then Sarah felt so light that she would not have been surprised if she had looked down and seen her feet floating a few inches above the pavement. She watched her gaggle of forest boys, all young men now, laughing and joking with Simon as though he had never been away. Away was the word Sarah used to describe Simon's dark years. She saw Septimus, confident in his apprentice robes, talking with her little Jenna, who looked so tall and queenly now. But best of all, Sarah saw her oldest son's eyes, bright green once more, shining with happiness as he looked around, no longer an outcast, back where he belonged, in the castle, with his family. Simon could hardly believe it himself. He was stunned at all the good wishes, and the feeling that people actually seemed to like him. Not so long ago, when he had lived below the ground in a dark place, he'd had dreams just like this, but he would wake from them in the middle of the night, distraught when he realized they were only dreams. Now, to his amazement, they had come true. The crowd continued to grow, and it looked as if Simon and Lucy were going to be at the palace gate for a while yet. On the edge of the crowd, Marcia Overstrand cut an imposing figure. She was wearing ceremonial extraordinary wizard robes of embroidered purple silk, lined with the softest, highly expensive marsh-mouse fur. From below the robes, 2 pointy shoes made of purple python skin peeked out into the white snow. Marcia's dark wavy hair was held back in a formal gold extraordinary wizard headband, which glinted impressively in the winter sunlight. Marcia looked impressive, but prickly. Her green eyes found Septimus, and she beckoned irritably to her apprentice. Septimus excused himself from Jenna and hurried over to Marcia. He had promised Sarah that he would make sure Marcia didn't take over, and he could see the warning signs. "Septimus, have you seen that mess?" Marcia demanded. Septimus followed the direction of Marcia's pointing finger, although he knew exactly what she was talking about. At the end of Ceremonial Way, which led straight up from the palace gate, a tall column of scaffolding covered with a brilliant blue tarpaulin reared up, garish against the snow. Around it were scattered untidy piles of bricks and a clutter of builders' equipment. "Yes," Septimus replied, not very helpfully in Marcia's opinion. "It's Marcellus, isn't it? What is he doing starting already?" Septimus shrugged. He didn't see why Marcia was asking him, especially as Marcia still hadn't set a date for him to begin his month with Marcellus. "Why don't you ask him?" he said. Marcia looked a little guilty. "Well, I promised your mother when she came to see me that there would be no, arguments." "Mum came to see you?" asked Septimus, surprised. Marcia sighed. "Yes, she brought me the guest list and said that if there was anyone on it I didn't like, she would quite understand if I didn't come. Naturally, I said that of course I was coming to Simon's wedding, and it didn't matter at all who was there. She didn't look convinced, I must say. I ended up promising her that I would be, well," Marcia pulled a face, "nice to everyone." "Wow." Septimus glanced across at Sarah Heap with new respect. "Apprentice! Marcia!" Marcellus Pye's voice caught their attention. Marcellus had escaped the clutches of Mrs. Gringe and was desperate to talk to someone, even Marcia. "Well, well," he said jovially, "you both look very splendid." "Not quite as splendid as you do, Marcellus," said Marcia, eyeing the alchemist's new set of black robes, the sleeves of which were slashed to show the red velvet shirt he was wearing underneath. Both cloak and tunic were liberally sprinkled with gold fastenings that glittered in the sunlight. Septimus could tell that Marcellus had made a big effort. His dark hair was freshly cut in a short bob and brushed forward over his forehead, in the old-fashioned style that the alchemist still favored on special occasions, and he was wearing his favorite pair of red shoes, the ones that Septimus had given him for his birthday 2 years previously. Marcia noticed the shoes and tutted. They still gave her an uncomfortable twinge of jealousy, of which she was not proud. Marcia waved her arm in the direction of the tarpaulin. "I see you have already begun," she said, a little disapprovingly. She forced herself to refrain from adding that Marcellus had agreed not to begin building the chimney until the great chamber of alchemy had been reopened. Septimus saw Marcellus give a guilty start. "Goodness! What, makes you say that?" "Well, I should have thought it was obvious. That rubbish at the end of Ceremonial Way." Septimus saw a look of relief fly across Marcellus's face. "Ah, the chimney," he said. "I am merely making preparations. I know you do not wish to keep the two-faced ring for longer than necessary. Keeping that ring safe must be a nightmare." As she had promised Sarah, Marcia made an effort. "Yes, it is. But at least we have it, Marcellus, thanks to you." Septimus looked impressed. His mother had done a remarkable job, he thought. Marcellus felt encouraged. He decided to ask a favor. "I wonder, Marcia, if you would object to a change of name." Marcia was flummoxed. "I am perfectly happy with Marcia," she said. No, I mean the Ceremonial Way. In the old days, when the great chamber was operating, and we had the chimney at the end of it, as we soon will again, it used to be called Alchemy Way. I wonder if you would allow it to resume its old name." "Oh," said Marcia. "Well, I suppose so. It was called Alchemy Way before, so it is only right that it is Alchemy Way once more." "Thank you," Marcellus beamed. "And soon Alchemy Way will lead to the newly built Alchemy Chimney." He sighed. "Well, it will when the builders bother to turn up." A sudden outbreak of cheering and clapping signaled that the wedding party was beginning to head off to the palace. Marcellus slipped away before Marcia had a chance to ask any more awkward questions. Marcia felt dismal. An evening spent with a mixture of Heaps and Gringes did not figure anywhere on her good nights out list, not even at the very bottom. She glanced back longingly toward the Wizard Tower, wondering if she could make a run for it. Septimus intercepted her glance. "You can't leave now. That would be very rude," he told her sternly. "Of course I'm not leaving now," Marcia said tartly. "Whatever gave you that idea?" The wedding supper carried on late into the night. Heaps and Gringes did not always mix well, and there were a few tricky moments, particularly when Mrs. Gringe put the duck stew suggestion to Sarah Heap. But nothing, not even Mrs. Gringe's insistence that it would be no trouble at all to take the duck home, and seeing as it was nice and plump, it would do enough for everyone, and she could bring the stew over the next day to save Sarah the bother of cooking, could dent Sarah's happiness for long. She had all her children with her for the first time ever, and that was enough for her. Marcia was surprised to find that her evening was not as bad as she had feared. After some very tedious speeches by various increasingly merry Heap uncles, a welcome distraction appeared. Through the long windows of the ballroom, which reached to the floor and looked out across the palace lawns down to the river, a barge ablaze with lights was seen drawing up to the palace landing stage. "Goodness, who can that be?" Marcia commented to Jenna, who was sitting next to her. Jenna knew who it was. "It's my father, late as usual." "Oh, how nice," said Marcia, and then hurriedly, "Not nice that he is late, of course. Nice that he has made it to the wedding." "Just about," said Jenna. Silas and the 4 Heap uncles, glad of an excuse to escape, went to inspect the barge and escort Milo back to the wedding supper. He arrived resplendent in what some people thought was the dress uniform of an admiral of the fleet, and others were sure they had seen in the window of a fancy dress shop in the port. But whatever it was he was wearing, Milo caused a stir. He strode up to the bride, bowed, kissed her hand, and presented her with a tiny ship of gold in a crystal bottle, much to Lucy's delight. Then he congratulated Simon, and took his seat next to Jenna. It was not long before Jenna made an excuse to go and talk to the Forest Heaps at the far end of the table. Milo then took Jenna's place next to Marcia, and from that moment Marcia found the evening was much improved, so much so that she stayed rather longer than she had planned.